let me start briefly introduce Professor Mankiw, and then we will start with the interview. It's my pleasure to introduce our esteemed guest, Professor Gregory Mankiw. He's currently a professor of economics at Harvard University, where he has been teaching and inspiring countless students for many years. Professor Mankiw has also served as the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, showcasing his expertise in guiding economic policy at the highest levels. With numerous publications to his name, including the widely used textbook Principle of Economics, Professor Mankiw has had a profound effect on the way we understand and teach economics. His research covers a wide range of topics, including macroeconomics, monetary policy, and the role of institutions in economic development. As a part of our seminar series, we have been asking all our distinguished speakers the question, what do economists do? Today, we have the privilege of hearing Professor Mankiw's unique perspective on this important topic, as well as gaining insights into how he personally chose his career path. Professor Mankiw is widely recognized as a leading economist, an accomplished academic, and a prominent figure in the field. Throughout his career, he's made significant contributions to the study of economics and has been instrumental in shaping our understanding of the subject. His journey into the field of economics, like many others, began with a series of decisions and experiences that led him down to this path. Today, we have the opportunity to hear directly from Professor Mankiw about how he decided to pursue a career in economics and the factors that influenced his choice. By exploring the question, what do economists do, and understanding the personal motivations behind career choices, we hope to inspire and guide our students as they navigate their own paths in economics. Without further ado, let us warmly welcome Professor Mankiw as he shares his insights on what economics do and the journey that had led him to choose his career path. Welcome, Professor.
Well, thank you. It's a delight to be with you.
So, during our seminars, we always start with the same question. What do economists do? And we ask our guest speakers to share their key milestones or experiences in their career that have shaped their career decisions and influenced their interests. So could you please share some significant moments or experiences that have had a profound impact on your understanding of economics, or maybe your choice of becoming an economist in the first place?
Sure. Let me tell you my own sort of path into the field. When I entered college, I did not envision economics as my career path. In fact, I probably didn't know exactly what my career path was going to be. I had the idea I'd like to be a professor because I had some exposure to what a professor's lifestyle was like, the tremendous academic freedom and personal freedom that living in a university provides. So the idea of being a professor appealed to me, but I wasn't exactly sure what I'd be a professor of. In fact, my first declared major was mathematics. And I did that because I kind of liked math when I was in high school. I thought I was good in math. I mean, I was good in math in the sense I was probably the best math student in my relatively small high school of 80 students. I said, oh, that must be good enough to be a mathematician. But then I get to college and I see people who are really good in math. And then I realized, okay, being the best math student in the group of 80 high school students is not the same as being talented enough in math to be a mathematician. And I sort of started thinking that, I'd be probably a perfectly good high school math teacher, but I probably couldn't make it as a professor of mathematics. So I started looking around for other things. And then fortuitously, I happened to have a friend who was taking an economics course, and she would come back from her economics course and tell me what she was learning. This was freshman year of college, first semester. And it seemed really interesting. I wasn't exactly sure what economics was. I had some vague idea, but didn't really know. But what she was telling me seemed really interesting. It seemed like very straightforward and sensible applications of relatively low-level mathematics. I mean, it was not high-level math, but it was using mathematical tools. And I thought that was quite interesting. And so I picked up her textbook, which I remember was Lipsey and Steiner. I don't know if that book is even in print anymore, but I started reading it and I said, this is really interesting stuff. And so the next semester, my second semester, first year of college, I started taking economics courses and had some great teachers. And that really turned me onto the field. One of the great teachers I had was Harvey Rosen, who taught at Princeton for many years. And it was a famously great teacher. I mean, he's magical in the classroom. And he got me he was teaching the introductory micro course. And he really got me fascinated by it. And so I went to him and applied for a job to see if I could work as his research assistant. This was kind of amazing because I was only a freshman and I'd only taken introductory economics. So asking for a job as a research assistant was kind of a bold thing to do, but I didn't know that at the time. I knew almost no economics at that point, but I did have one skill which is useful, which was I knew how to program computers. I had taken courses in Fortran programming. And he was working on some research project where Fortran programming was an important part of the project. So he hired me for the first summer after college. So the summer after first year of college. And I spent the summer basically doing programming for him. And he needed to teach me all the economics that I needed for the job. And so I spent a lot of time teaching myself some economics, getting tutoring from Harvey. And I just learned a tremendous amount, and I decided that becoming a professor of economics looked like a good career path for me. That sort of started my path. I then sort of went on. I then went on and had interactions with several other really great economists. I wrote my senior thesis at Princeton with Alan Blinder, who's another great macroeconomist at Princeton. I then went on to MIT to get my PhD, and there I met Larry Summers, who was I was 1980, and he was a relatively young guy. He was already a great economist, but not yet a famous one. So I was kind of lucky to be in that short window between when Larry was great but he wasn't yet famous. So he actually had a lot of time for students, and I learned a lot from Larry. And in fact, he went down the Council of Economic Advisors when Marty Feldstein became chair of the Council of Economic Advisors for President Ronald Reagan. And Marty Feldstein brought some of his former students down, including Larry Summers. And Larry Summers basically hired me to come down for a year at the council to work as his assistant, basically. And so I worked closely with Larry for that year. I then came back to MIT to finish my PhD and worked with Stan Fisher, another sort of great macroeconomist. And so it's really those are the sort of the four economists that were most influential in my career path: Harvey Rosen, then Alan Blinder, then Larry Summers, and then Stan Fisher. And they very much set the pattern for me as to how I was going to sort of lead my career.
When you told us that your career transitioned from being a mathematician to an economist, a question came to my mind, because our students often complain about the mathematical calculations in economics. So it's I have both learned and taught with your textbooks, special principle of economics. I know that you use little mathematics, and that makes the textbook quite accessible. So what is your take on the relationship between mathematics and economics?
Well, I think of mathematics as basically the language of logic, and it's really just a language for communicating. So I think all economists have to feel some level of comfort with mathematics. Obviously, different economists are at different degrees. I think it was Alfred Marshall who famously said something like, you work out your theory in mathematics, but then you turn it into English and learn the mathematics. We don't do that anymore. We keep the mathematics in there, but I think it's very important that you turn the the math back into natural language, and which for me is English, because you're trying to communicate. I mean, the main thing about writing anything, whether it's a journal article or an undergraduate textbook, you're trying to communicate with the reader, and you have to recognize that the readers have a whole variety of different levels of comfort with mathematics. And I always recommend students to get tooled up as much mathematics as they can, so they can understand as much. It's like expanding your own language skills. But when you write, you don't want to write for people who are as tooled up mathematically as you, because not everybody's going to be. And then you want to reach the widest possible audience. And so you want to use the mathematics where you need it, but also keep it to a bare you can reach the widest possible audience. I wouldn't go as far as Marshall and say you burn all the mathematics, but you do try to keep it for a minimum. And that's especially true for the textbooks I write. My textbooks are aimed at undergraduates. And I think the undergraduate audience, especially for the introductory economics, should be very broad. It's not only future economics majors, but it's the person who wants to become an English major and then a playwright, which was my college roommate was a playwright and an English major. So I want to write a book so that he can understand it too. I don't want to only teach future economists. I want to teach everybody about what economics is about. And so that's why I really try very hard to keep mathematics to a minimum, even while encouraging my students to go take more mathematics, which it sounds paradoxical, but I think it really does. It has a sort of a consistent worldview behind it.
I agree. It warms up students to the field of economics, and then they encounter more mathematics as they progress.
That's right.
Very general question. So your work on principle of economics has had a significant effect on the field, including in the Turkish higher education system. Could you discuss the importance of teaching and understanding these principles, particularly for aspiring economists?
Well, yeah, there used to be a rule at Harvard. Doesn't exist anymore, but there used to be a rule at Harvard that everyone who joined the junior faculty, their first 2 years, they would have to be involved in teaching introductory economics. And I'm kind of sad that that rule has gone away, because I think the introductory economics course is where you really go back to first principles. You're talking to people who don't know any economics, and they're coming and seeing how a complete novice sees the field forces you to rethink how you see the field. And so I've really enjoyed writing my principles text and teach. I taught that course for many, many years, because you really you see how a person outside the field perceives our utility. And ultimately, I mean, economists spend a lot of the time just writing for each other. And that's, of course, true of any discipline. And that's fine. I don't object to that. But ultimately, our utility in the universe is going to be based on how well we can influence the thinking of people who are not inside our discipline. And learning how to communicate with people outside the discipline is an extremely useful skill, especially, I mean, when you're trying to influence the general public through, articles in the newspaper, or when you're advising policymakers who are unlikely to be professional economists. You want to be able to talk about economics, knowing that your audience is not an economist, and that's something that's something I've worked very hard at over the years. One thing I did mention about my academic path is I had a slight detour into law school, where I spent a year and a half in law school before I convinced myself, no, being a lawyer was not actually my calling. That was, I wouldn't recommend, it's not a detour I would necessarily recommend to anyone, but it did have the side benefit of maybe making me understand a bit how lawyers think. And if you think of most policymakers, if you look at the US Congress, for example, and I don't know if it's true in your country, but a large fraction of people involved in making policy are trained in law, not trained in economics. And so understanding how these people think is useful. And so keeping those kind of people in mind as you're writing economics, especially when you're writing undergraduate textbooks, is I think a useful thing to do.
And of course, you have updated your book several times. And now I think this is also one of our students, in line with one of our students' questions. Now we are sort of in a new era for accessing the information. Of course, we have had internet, and then now language models, artificial intelligence, language models. How do you think that's going to affect economic teaching and all the material we have accumulated over the years?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, both of my books sell more now in ebook form than they do in physical book form.
Yes.
And some publishers are trying to. I think most publishers are basically pushing ebooks more than they are physical books. In fact, if you look at the pricing of the physical books, it's kind of ridiculous how expensive they are. And one of the reasons they're so expensive is they don't really want to sell physical books. They really want to sell ebooks. So in an ebook, basically you get a subscription to the online book for a period of time, and the longer you want it, the more you pay, and then it goes away. It's a much lower price point than the physical book, but you're only getting a subscription to a digital service for a period of months. I'm kind of old-fashioned enough to feel sad about that. I like physical books. And I spend I write summer now, which is the time of year I read a lot, and I read everything in physical book form. I don't sit there with an iPad. So I like physical books, but they're moving but textbooks are clearly moving towards this digital model. That does have some advantages in the sense that it's not like you're just getting the book in digital format. You're also getting a variety of learning systems that go along with it that wouldn't be possible in a physical book. So the digital book will include, for example, embedded videos explaining different concepts. I mean, some of the videos you get to see my lovely face. Other videos, you're seeing little cartoons explaining something. What is elasticity or something? So you see these little videos. There's online homework that can be automatically graded by the computer, and the grade even registered in the professor's grade book. So there's a variety of things you can do, and I'm sure it's only a matter of time before there's some AI system that will answer your questions. Now, I've used enough of ChatGPT to know it's not really accurate all the time now, so I wouldn't put it in a textbook yet. But I think it doesn't seem like it's insurmountable that they will solve the accuracy problem. And if you have an artificial intelligence system that accurately answers student questions, that would be an amazing resource. Because if they have a question that as they're reading the book, I don't understand this, can you explain it to me differently? It's only a matter of time before that's a feature of these digital books. It's not yet, but it will be within 10 years, I'm sure. So I think it's changing the way we teach. I should say, by the way, it's also affected the business of textbook publishing. It's actually a terrible business right now. If you look at revenues, total revenue from the textbook industry, it's down like 50% in the past 10 years. Because in part because there's a movement towards cheaper digital things, in part because it's much easier for students to share resources like rent books and share digital books and so on. So students are spending a lot less money on textbooks than they did in the past. So I think people who work in this industry, it's kind of a sad time because they're in a sense of contraction. But for the students' standpoint, it's probably a good thing because things are available more cheaply, they're spending less money, and there's an increasing variety of tools that they wouldn't have had when I was a student.
Yeah. And now we are having more open access options. I think this is how publishers are dealing with this.
Yes, it's interesting. There's some open access options. I'm skeptical that that's going to be the wave of the future because there's a fair amount of effort into developing these tools, both writing the books and developing online resources, and that's going to be paid for somehow. Now, some of these online resources have gotten grants from foundations, and that's an alternative model. But you're not going to get the software developers and the textbook authors and everybody to work for free. You got to. So creating these things is not free. It's got to be paid for somehow. And my guess is this problem. I don't know if the foundation world will be sufficient to cover all the costs on an ongoing basis.
True, true. Now that you also talked about ChatGPT, I realized that we had a question from a student on this, and I think this student is one of the followers of your blog, and he says that we noticed that you're active on social media, and he's referring to your blog, I think, to share your ideas on current issues, economic policies, and even your experience with language models like ChatGPT. I myself also have seen your post there. So considering the rise of AI-powered language models and their potential impact, how do you envision these technologies affecting the labor market in the future?
Yeah, that's interesting. Automation of all sorts of things in general has profound effects on the labor market. There's this old tradition, going back really hundreds of years, fear of technology. Fear of technology is going to make everybody unemployed. And I regularly try to dispel that fear. And the way I think about it is, I said, imagine you went to the world 200 years ago and you said, we're going to invent these great fertilizers and farm hybrid and seed hybrids and all sorts of agricultural technology so that we can feed the entire world with only 2% of the world being farmers. Mm-hmm. If it's 200 years ago, that would have seemed like, how could that possibly be? Most people were farmers. And so this idea that you could feed the world with so few farmers would sound scary, because like, well, what are people going to spend all their time doing? Everybody will be unemployed. Well, the answer, of course, would be that you become other things. You become software designers and CAT scan operators, and you have all these new jobs that didn't exist 200 years ago. Now, if you told somebody that 200 years ago, they wouldn't know what you're talking about, because they wouldn't know what a software designer is. Mm-hmm. But new jobs come up as the old jobs disappear, and so I'm confident that that'll happen as well with artificial intelligence. Even if I can't tell you what those jobs are, just like 200 years ago, I couldn't tell you that software designers were going to be a bigger deal than farmers. Mm-hmm. Today, there will be a job of some sort in the future. There's this famous essay by John Maynard Keynes, written almost 100 years ago now, called "Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren." And what Keynes basically said, he predicted that productivity over the next century would rise about 8-fold. And as a result, he said, we really don't need as much labor input. And he predicted that the work week would get down to 15 hours around now, 15 hours a week. So we basically, instead of having a work week, we have like a weekend where we work, and then 5 days of a weekend. Mm-hmm. And I think, and what's interesting is two things that were interesting. First, he was right about productivity. Productivity rose almost exactly what he predicted. But this idea that we're only working 15 hours a week is, of course, completely wrong. And I think the mistake he made is he didn't appreciate that productivity usually takes the form of new products, not just producing the same old products and more of them, right? At some point, if you're consuming a certain number of calories, you don't want, and you're 8 times as productive, you don't need to consume 8 times as many calories. So that's not good for you. Similarly, if you have 2 bathrooms in your house and we're 8 times as productive, you're not going to have, I need 16 bathrooms in my house, right? Mm-hmm. So it's not like you consume 8 times as much of the old stuff as you did before. When you're 8 times as productive, you start consuming new things that are different. And so as a result, we're not. I mean, Keynes thought at this point everybody would be fully satiated with 8 times as much productivity. We'd have everything we wanted, and we probably have enough. Most people have enough bathrooms, and most people have enough calories. Maybe some in the United States, the problem is many people have too many calories. Obesity is a bigger problem than malnutrition, but productivity is taking the form of, big screen TVs or your Apple phone, and all sorts of other things that we couldn't even have imagined 100 years ago. And so I suspect that something similar will happen going forward. So I'm not nearly as concerned about the adverse effect, the productivity effects of AI. I'm worried about certain effects, things like the ability to create fake news stories. The idea that you can sort of create an avatar that looks just like a real person, and then you can have it say anything you want. That's a little scary at the internet age. So as I think I think telling truth from reality may become harder and harder as these fake sources of information become easier to manipulate. But so I think there are risks associated with AI. This idea that that we're going to put everybody out of a job because of AI does not strike me as realistic.
Maybe traditionally, of course, we have thought technology would replace unskilled workers. It's the first time maybe in this story we feel like technology, artificial intelligence is threatening skilled people, doctors, lawyers. So that's an interesting.
Well, yes, I mean, that's right. You're absolutely right. Skilled biased technological change, which is technology mainly replacing unskilled workers, is one of the causes of rising inequality.
Yes.
It wouldn't be terrible if we had the opposite. If we had skilled biased technological change that was making skilled workers less attractive, less needed. So that could cause a more equal world. And that's probably that'd probably be a good thing overall.
Interesting.
Fortunately, they haven't figured out how to use AI to write textbooks yet, but maybe that'll happen soon.
Yes. Professor Polat, I think you have a question.
Thank you. Dear Professor Mankiw, firstly, I want to say that we are really privileged and honored to host you today. So in that sense, thank you very much for accepting our invitation today. I am Ali Polat, a faculty member at Abdullah Üniversitesi Economics Department. Actually, the discussion is really interesting about these new technologies, but I will change the gears a bit through back to the book, the main textbook that you have written, the influential one. Actually, what I want to ask is after 2000, especially after the 2008 financial crisis, there was, as you know, a discussion about this undergraduate education in economics departments, especially mainly in macroeconomics, maybe. So do you think the academic education, especially in the US and other parts of the world, has responded to these issues in an inclusive manner? So what I mean is something like that. Maybe it is maybe better to give an example. For example, these behavioral theories, experimental evidence are not taught usually in detail, maybe somewhere in small part, but in detail in many introductory and intermediate level textbooks. And I personally believe that students should first master benchmark theories, then they should understand these, how can I say, deviation from the classical assumptions. So in that sense, it was a long introduction, but my main question is, do you think is there is any more room for revising or restructuring these basic or like intermediate level textbooks and generally this economic education in mainstream departments in the US? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, you allude to, I think, was an important development in our field, which is that behavioral economics is probably the biggest single change in the field over my lifetime. When I was a student, a grad student in the 1980s, the field of behavioral economics really didn't exist. And then over the following 40 years, it became very dominant. And it's very, I mean, at Harvard, it has a very big investment, and we have quite a few leading scholars, including Matthew Rabin and David Leibson, and so I have followed it. Even though I'm not sort of in that field, I followed it very closely. The first edition of my textbooks had no mention of behavioral economics. It was much more traditional stuff, supply and demand, and comparative advantage, and quantity theory of money, that sort of stuff. I think, and they've changed over time. Now I have discussion of behavioral economics in both my intermediate book, where I talk about Leibson's and Thaler's work, and in my principles book, where I talk about sort of some of the systematic biases, things like overconfidence, time inconsistency, and so on. So both books now include sections. One of the tricky thing to remember when you're teaching or writing a textbook is that economic knowledge advances, and we know more and more. And so therefore it's tempting to add more and more to the course. But the problem is the student's capacity to learn information is not expanding together with economic knowledge. So if you only have like one course, if you like, just a few months or maybe a full year to teach people introductory economics, you have to recognize that their capacity to learn is not expanding along with the economic knowledge. So if you decide, oh, there's something else I want to add, you have to say, okay, what do I want to take out?
Yes.
And that's why you have to be very, very conscious of student time. And it's very tempting for a textbook author to basically turn it into an encyclopedia, just keep adding more and more and more and more. And that's not going to serve anyone in the long run, because that's too overwhelming. So my own view is it's actually quite similar to what you said yours was, which is that we need to make sure to teach them the basics. I think it's useful now to say, look, these are the basic tools. There's this field called behavioral economics that calls some of these conclusions into question. But I think you need to sort of start off with the basics. I mean, economics has a very long tradition. I mean, going back, well over 200 years. If you think of Adam Smith, maybe about 250 years. So there's a lot of accumulated knowledge, and we have to be careful. Even though the recent stuff like behavioral economics is important, we have to be careful to be respectful of the stuff that came before. So I think the ideas of Adam Smith and David Ricardo and David Hume are extremely important, and still need to sort of be in there and to find the right balance. So what I do every edition is I try to figure out, do I have the right balance? Should I take something out in order to put something else in? And it's always a big challenge. So for example, one of the questions. Let me give you a very concrete example. I have this chapter in my introductory book that does basically the theory of the consumer, talking about budget constraints and indifference curves, and it's income and substitution effects. It's sort of a basic theory of the consumer that's been taught for many years. I know from surveys we've done that only about half of the instructors teach that. So I understand that this time is limited, and so half of them said, "No, I don't have time for this, and I have more time for something else." But that's a tricky thing. I mean, how important is that to teach introductory students? I can kind of see the argument both ways. I have it there, but it's towards the end of the book, sort of as an optional chapter. But I recognize that maybe at some point people say, "I want to spend more time in behavioral economics, and I'm not going to do the theory of the consumer." I mean, I'm not there yet in my own teaching, but I can see how other people might reach that judgment. So I think it's always difficult. To give you another example, in the most recent edition, I don't know if you have the most recent edition. It's only been out a few months, but the most recent edition, I have a chapter on Introduction to Econometrics. That is, people usually don't think of econometrics as something they teach in introductory economics, but increasingly, economics has become empirical because we have big data sets, we've got great computing power. So the way we do economics research has evolved over time, and econometrics is growing in importance. And my colleague Raj Chetty has a course which he teaches for freshmen that teaches, which is not an introductory economics course, but it's something that you can be taking concurrently with an economics introductory course. But it's basically a course explaining his research on economic mobility and the use of big data sets to study economic mobility. I watched his lectures, which are available online, by the way. So if you go to his website, you can sort of find his lectures. They're great lectures. He's fantastic, and watching his lectures convinced me that yes, you can teach basic econometrics to freshmen. And so I added a new edition of this chapter. It's actually sort of an appendix chapter. It's at the very end of the book, and I'm guessing most people will not teach it. But for those who want to say, I'm not going to teach indifference curves, I'm going to teach basic econometrics, that's a reasonable judgment call. And so I try to write the book to increase flexibility, and I think that's I think that's a useful thing to perhaps add. But we should be mindful that as we add something, we have to subtract something else. We just can't add more and more and more.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Maybe I'm going to pass the floor to Professor Choose to ask his question. Maybe right before that, I can connect the two discussions because we were talking about technology, artificial intelligence, and now theories and challenges. One of the questions, I think, with all this new technology, big data, machine learning, and artificial intelligence, this is not a new discussion, but people start to ask, is theory dead? Or do we still need theories? And what is your take on that?
Oh, no, I don't. Yeah, I know. I think we definitely need theory. I don't think the data can ever speak for themselves so loudly that we don't need some theoretical structure to make sense of things. So no, I don't think theory is that at all. A different question is, there's two questions. I mean, is theory definitely something what we're teaching students? And then I think absolutely not, because there's 2 centuries of very important theory, and that remains important. The other question is, from a research standpoint, is theory dead? Which means, where's the incremental knowledge going to come from? Are there going to be big advances in theory in the same way there are big advances in, say, behavioral economics, or big advances in empirical work? Maybe not. It might be the case. I mean, it might be the case we have a lot of theory we need to teach, but incremental knowledge is coming from somewhere else at this moment in history, and that's hard. That's hard to know. It's hard to talk. You know, I always think of research as a little bit like this sort of an efficient markets hypothesis about research, which means if I knew where the path of research was going to go, I wouldn't tell you I'd go do it. And you know, it's so much in the same way that you can't predict stocks. It's very hard to predict, I think, research, which the path of research is going to go. But I think in terms of what we're teaching, I think the 2 centuries of theory that's been developed through great scholars like Paul Samuelson and Ken Arrow and their predecessors, that I think that material is still crucially important. And I don't think that body of knowledge is going to become made obsolete by fast computers.
Professor Shoes? We cannot hear you.
Thank you so much for joining us. Yeah, I also used for long years your textbook, and I'm more familiar with the older editions, and in generally very, very transparent, very useful for the undergraduate teaching. I'm hooked up a little bit with some points. I have to constrain myself. I will start with one example, and that has something to do with translating concepts back into English. When we talk about consumer surplus, you are calling that in the textbook willingness to pay. That always seemed to me a little bit inappropriate. For me, it is willingness and ability to pay. For example, if parents of a child who have a deadly disease cannot afford that, I mean, you can say, yes, I know the theory. So in theory, we are saying, okay, forget about distribution. Think about distribution as fine, and then just think about the efficiency. Okay, but that is not how it's done in the undergraduate book. No, we are introducing it as willingness to pay, and maybe it's just convention. I would ask you if one shouldn't change that a little bit, willingness and ability to pay. Another thing which sticks to my mind is, and that has something to do with what Professor Pollard said, it seems to be more that the principle of economics is a principle of microeconomics and macroeconomics. I had the feeling that a third column of mainstream economics is new institutional economics, which has, of course, also a long historical tradition. So if you would create from scratch a new textbook, would you include more institutional economics in the sense property rights are so important, markets versus central planning, what information does for us, and transaction costs and so on? And then the third point, sorry to overwhelm you with different points going in different angles.
Can I answer the first 2 and then you can go back?
Okay,
sure. If you give me too many questions, I may forget them by the time you. Okay, so on willingness to pay, I'd be perfect. If you want to put willingness and ability to pay throughout, that'd be fine. I try to be succinct. So if every time I said willingness to pay, I said willingness and ability to pay, that's going to add 2 words every time I use that phrase, which is a lot. And so trying to be, so it's really just trying to be succinct. So I really don't object to your friendly edit. And so I think I have to go back and check. I think the first time I introduced it, I talked about ability, but only briefly. I certainly talk about how this doesn't. I certainly talk about this doesn't talk about inequality. You know, that is equity is a big part of economic policy, and this measure of consumer surplus doesn't address that. So I certainly I take that as a very important caveat, and I try to stress that with my students. So I don't think we're in fundamental disagreements. It's really about how you write. I always try to come up with short phrases rather than long phrases. And also I try to favor short words rather than long words. On the second one, institutional economics, you're absolutely right. The role of institutions has grown. You know, if I'd been a better student of people like Douglas North and so on, I would have known this when I wrote my first edition. But certainly in my own, if someone wanted to do a study of the evolution of my own thinking, which I don't recommend, by the way. If you wanted to do I don't think it's that interesting a topic, but somebody wanted to do a study of the evolution of my thinking, they could compare the different editions over time. And one of the differences they would find for sure is a growing appreciation of the role of institutions. And that particularly comes up in the chapters where I'm talking about economic growth and, you know, why some countries are more prosperous than others. That you have to think about the role of institutions. And if you look at my intermediate book, there's discussions of legal institutions. There's a discussion of some Daron Acemoglu. I mean, in both books, I think there's a discussion of Daron Acemoglu's work on institutions and colonial development. Yep. So there's no question that has grown in importance in my own thinking, and that's reflected, I think, in the books. And the place to look for that is mainly the newer editions on the chapters on economic growth, where you'll see a discussion of institutions. Whereas I think if you look at the back of the first edition, you wouldn't find that. Every edition, I mean, I update the books every 3 years, in part because the world changes, but in part because my own thinking changes. And I think I become a better economist over time. As my own thinking gets refined, I think I get reflected in the books. But you have a third question, so I'll turn the floor back over to you.
Yes, the Principles of Economics has also very rich index. So that is also to do a lot of work, and it's very helpful. But we don't find one word, exploitation. So we find poverty, discrimination, but interestingly, I mean, and poverty is also, you know, multidimensional, multidisciplinary phenomenon. So I'm wondering, why not exploitation? And that could be, of course, discussed very controversial. No?
Yeah, it's funny. The word exploitation is not a word I know exactly how to translate into economics, and so I'm not so you know, it comes so the idea, not the word, comes up in different places. So for example, you know, again back to Daron Acemoglu's work in colonial development, he talks a lot about extractive institutions set up in certain colonies. And so I talk about his word. In fact, I use his word, extractive institutions, which I guess you could think of as a form of exploitation, although I don't actually use the word exploitation. And similarly, in my principles book, in the chapter on labor economics, there is a discussion of monopsony. And that's actually the most recent edition, the one that just came out a few months ago. This section on monopsony powers. I know there's no literature on this. That maybe monopsonies in the labor market is a bigger deal than economists have formerly appreciated, at least that I formerly appreciated. So I've expanded the cover of monopsony power, which I guess is also a form of exploitation. But I try to stick to words that I understand as an economist. That the word exploitation, I understand that it seems to me it seems politically charged, and also doesn't really connect to fundamental economic forces. Whereas I think that Acemoglu's work on extractive institutions or the work on monopsony power, that I think is somebody might interpret that as a form of exploitation, but I think those are economic concepts that I understand more clearly.
I would humbly suggest you could criticize Karl Marx and the Marxist traditions. That would be a starting point. A totally other starting point is looking at a daily life example, which would probably be uncontroversially exploitative, like illegal immigrant workers. And where do we have the connection with the economic model? Freedom of decision. Now, we are working with markets when we have a certain freedom to decide, at least to say yes or no, but sometimes also much more freedom. So, so more and more that freedom is restricted. For example, there's modern slave work around the world, and we are somehow, as normal consumers, even profiting from it. No? Some of the cheap prices will be affected by the labor costs, and some of the labor costs are in some authoritarian systems. You have something like forced labor, slave work, and so on. So one could start with their daily life examples and try to make an economic analysis out of it. So that would be my suggestion.
Yeah, you're right. I don't talk about slavery around the world at all. I mean, maybe because a large part of my audience is in the developed world, where it's not a prominent feature of the economy. But yeah, I mean, it's one of those topics that modern slavery I don't cover. And I do, it's interesting. In the new edition, I do talk a little bit about Nathan Nunn's work about the historical impact of slavery and how that affected African development. So if you look at the most recent edition, on this, there's a section on the development. Why is sub-Saharan Africa among the poorest regions of the world, and talks about a variety of hypotheses as to why that is the case. And I do connect to Nathan Nunn's work on slavery, but that's not modern slavery. That's just the historical influence of the African slave trade.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. One of the topics our students wanted to talk about, actually this comes from also from your book, Externalities, Negative Externalities of Economic Activity. Our students are really interested in, and we have received several questions on this, really interested in circular economies and their potential application in the future, but also their potential...
What kind of economies?
Circular economies.
Circular?
Yes, circular economies, is linear economies. So the idea that the resources can be generated within the system, and the minimum use of basic resources attracts our students' attention. And there are several questions on this. I wanted to direct one of them to you. So our student asked, what are your views on the potential impact of the circular economy on economic growth, environmental sustainability, and resource efficiency?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the term circular economy, so I'm not. I certainly understand the idea of sustainability and natural resource use. I spend a lot of time thinking about that. I've long time been a big fan of Pigovian taxation, of using the tax system to internalize externalities. In fact, it always struck me that's one of the ideas in economics that is vastly underapplied in the policy circles is using corrective taxes to deal with negative externalities. And so I always think it's one of the most central ideas in public policy. That's why it's featured relatively early in my principles text. And I've written many articles over the years about the case for Pigovian taxes, which seem to be particularly unpopular in the United States, unfortunately. I'm part of a group that's been trying to push for a carbon tax in the United States, which would reduce our reliance on fossil fuels and other carbon generating activities. But ultimately, I'm not. I think I'm not worried in the long run if we get the right policies that we can deal with natural resource issues, because I think most economic growth doesn't come from greater and greater exploitation of resources, but comes from smarter and smarter application of the resources we have. So I'm not I know there's some people who are critics of economic growth, thinking that growth has to necessarily come at the expense of the environment. I don't associate myself with that school. I think smart growth can be both environmentally sustainable and enhance living standards around the world.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Professor Doğan, I think you might have a related question.
Yes, hello, Prof. Mankiw. This is Dr. Eyüp from Economics Department. I am also very happy to see you in this platform. I am working on energy, environmental, economic, sustainability topics. So my question will be your thoughts on the importance of economics discipline in sustainability. As you well know, sustainability has various dimensions from multidisciplinary areas. So what will be the significance of economics discipline in the scope of sustainability, as well as the other two important terms, Industry 4.0, Industry 5.0, again, combines human, environmental, and social aspects within. So altogether, what will be your ideas, thoughts on this topic? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think climate change is the biggest long-run sustainability issue we face, and the reason it's so complicated is not only the politics are hard because things like carbon taxes are not politically popular, so that politics is hard. But what's also hard is that it's an international problem, and therefore requires coordination of lots of countries. And as we see both in the relationships between the West and Russia now, or the West and China over things like Taiwan, international cooperation is strained. And so I worry that we don't have the sort of international institutions to support what's needed to happen at a global level. I think we might be able to establish them over time, but the world right now seems particularly fragmented, and it's hard to see. So I think we have the tools. I'm of two minds of what might happen in the future. I mean, one possibility is that we never manage to get the right policies in place to deal with climate change. And if that's the case, then we'll just have to deal with mitigation. That is, how do we survive in a world with rising temperatures? But I'm also hopeful that there might be other things that are moving in a more positive direction. So, for example, I know there's a lot of work on carbon capture. So maybe the issue is going to be less reducing use of fossil fuels and more like, can we find some way to get carbon out of the atmosphere? I know there's work on geoengineering, figuring out ways to throw particles into the atmosphere in order to deflect some of the sunlight. And the other thing to keep in mind is a lot of the world is moving towards population growth below zero. So if the world population starts shrinking, that's going to naturally reduce the carbon footprint of humanity, and that could be a positive development as well. There's a book written about, I can tell, about 25 years ago by Bill McKibben, who's a well-known environmentalist writer, and the book was called Maybe One, and the argument was that people should move toward one-child families. Because he thought he thought that the easiest way to reduce the humanity's carbon footprint was for humanity to be smaller, have fewer people on the planet, and so that's the basic argument of the book. And I don't think we're moving toward that because of the environmental concerns. We are moving toward that. I think as a lot of developed countries, as they get richer, women decide to have fewer children. And so a lot of the developed world is below replacement rate now. And so Bill McKibben's solution may actually come to pass. Now, of course, shrinking population causes other problems. In particular, it makes things like government pension plans harder to sustain if you have a pay-as-you-go pension plan. So there are other problems associated with shrinking population, but it's not. I think those are surmountable. I think we can figure out how to deal with that. Deal with the fact that we're not going to have we may not have world population continuing to grow forever.
Thank you very much. So I realized one question that might be now in Q&A window that might be linked to this question. One of our students asks, considering the ever-changing global economic landscape, do you believe there are any new or emerging market failures that require novel approaches from policymakers?
Oh, that's a great question. It's a hard one. I mean, obviously, we've talked about climate change, and I think that's one of the biggest challenges we face right now globally. There's also interesting discussion about whether some of the new technologies are moving economies toward greater concentration. And the evidence at this point is, I think, mixed. So I don't think it's conclusive. But there's some evidence that markups have gone up and that industries are getting more concentrated. And that may be a result not of policy, but of just the nature of technology. That's so the new technologies have economies of scale and network externalities such that there's going to be increasing concentration and greater monopoly power. The question then becomes, how do we handle that? The Biden administration in the United States is taking a much more robust approach to antitrust policy, stopping mergers much more aggressively. It's not completely clear to me that's right, in the sense that there are efficiencies often with these mergers, but there's certainly more mergers are being blocked, and I think as a result, fewer mergers are being proposed. But I think the question is, how do we deal with competition policy in a world where technology is changing and maybe big and it's naturally moving toward less competitive competition. I don't know the answer to that. I don't even have a strong opinion about it, but I think it's one of the things I've been thinking about, and the implications for economics. My most recent academic publication, by the way, is an article that came out in just a couple months ago in the Review of Economic Studies, which is called Market Power and Neoclassical Growth Models, which basically says, okay, how do we think? It goes back to classical growth theory, like the solo growth model, and says, okay, well, how would you redo this model, and how would you interpret the world differently if you didn't think we lived in a world of perfect competition, which is implicitly assumed in things like the solo growth model? And it basically relooks at standard growth theory through the eyes of imperfect competition. So I think that if it's correct that we're moving towards a world of less competition, then trying to thinking more of economics through the lens of imperfect competition may be an important part of the research agenda.
And maybe not exactly related, but I would like to ask these questions because students keep asking questions in Q&A. One of our students asks, if you had the power to implement any radical economic policy or system overnight without facing any practical constraints, what would it be? And why do you believe it would lead to a more prosperous and equitable society?
Oh, I'll tell you the proposal. This is going to sound a little too mundane, but what I proposed with this group called the Climate Leadership Council was a universal carbon tax, and used all the revenue to rebate it lump sum. So the idea would be it would incentivize people moving toward more carbon neutral technologies, but it would also provide a small universal basic income for everyone, because that lump sum transfer, that what we call the carbon dividend, that carbon dividend would provide basically a income support for everyone. If I could implement that around the world, the snap of my finger, I would do that. I don't see myself having that power anytime soon, though.
And maybe one of our students, Danilo, would you like to ask your question? Because Danilo, yeah, go ahead, Danilo.
Sure. You kind of answered my question in many ways in your answer, but I just keep seeing these imbalances that our linear processes of production have on the world. And lately I saw this article of degrowth, and I wanted to ask you, what are your thoughts on degrowth instead of growth as a new form of rationality, or let's say utility maximization for countries because we already produce enough. It's just how we are distributing it. As you say, obesity is a bigger problem than malnutrition. So yeah, what do you think of degrowth as a new form of rationality or utility?
When I hear about people proposing things like that, I'm reminded of my colleague's book. Ben Friedman is a good friend of mine who I've been teaching with for years. And he has a book out a few years ago called The Moral Consequences of Economic Growth. And the basic thesis of the book is that societies are more generous when growth is rapid. That is, when the pie is growing rapidly, people are much more open to the marginalized marginalized groups in society, and are much more open to like immigrants, to different racial groups. And then when the economic pie starts shrinking, people start fighting over that economic pie, and people become more polarized. And so I worry about the idea of a shrinking economic pie, thinking that it would make our politics more divisive. So I'm not very sympathetic to degrowth. I think we need smart growth, and especially if you have my view of growth, that it mainly comes from better ideas, I think, and not just more of the same. Then I think the idea of having more and better ideas is a great thing. And I think where a lot of growth is coming from now, it's coming from things like technology. It's coming from things like healthcare. And if to the extent that healthcare can provide better pharmaceuticals and better ways to prolong and enhance life, that's a good thing. I don't want to stop that kind of growth at all. I don't think growth has to come from having more and more of the same stuff. It doesn't mean going from 2 bathrooms in your house to 16. It kind of comes from having this drug. My father died not that much older than I am right now from heart disease. I now take a cholesterol-lowering drug that wasn't available when he was my age. So that kind of stuff. That's what when I think of growth, I think of that little pill I take every morning to lower my cholesterol and keeps me going. And I don't want to stop that process of growth.
Thank you very much. Maybe the last question. We accepted our first students in the economics department in 2019. So now the oldest generation is a training in introductory economics, but also intermediate economics, and now they've been studying econometrics, game theory, and behavioral and experimental economics. And of course, now they're about to jump into the labor market. I think that this could be the motivation. One of our students asked, in your opinion, which careers in economics do you believe are the most marketable?
Oh, marketable. One thing I love about economics is that it leads to lots of different career paths. With a degree in economics, you can become a professional economist, and that it could mean where you're working for academia, like I do, spent most of my life. It could mean working for policymakers in government, which I had done for a few years of my life. It could mean working for a private sector firm, like a financial firm, which hires lots of economists. But also a degree in economics can sort of lead to other things that are economics adjacent. So, for example, as I mentioned, I spent 1.5 years in law school. A lot of law is based on economic transactions, and a lot of the theory of law has a lot of economics in it, whether it's tax policy, antitrust policy, even basic things like contracts and torts, has a lot of basic economic logic in it. So I think it's a great pathway into that. To give you another example, my daughter is an economics major. After becoming an economics major, she then started taking some science courses and went to medical school. And now she got her medical degree and her MBA, her Master's of Business Administration. She's got both. It's just so and finally she's finished with school. At age 30, she's finally finished with school, and she's a physician now, which is very interested in the business side of medicine, and medical startups and new changes in technology, which I just talked about a minute ago. And so the combination of economics and medicine seems like a very strange combination. but it actually makes a lot of sense because I think there's a lot of, I mean, healthcare is a growing share of most economies around the world, especially the more developed economies. And so the economics of healthcare is increasingly important, and it's complicated. I should also get back to textbooks. The most recent edition of my textbook also added a chapter on the economics of healthcare. So maybe I was motivated in part by learning from my daughter, but it's a whole new chapter on the economics of healthcare. So I think economics is a great foundation for lots of different career paths. We need people on all those career paths. So I think economics is a great sort of starting point for these, and it's a tree that goes out in multiple directions that can do multiple different things. We need people everywhere. And the question of which was most marketable, I don't know. I'm not sure which is the easiest job to get. I haven't looked for a job in many decades, so I'm not a really good judge of the current marketability. But whichever direction you want to go, I think economics is a good foundation.
Thank you very much, Professor Mankiw. We are tremendously grateful for your input. We are a small university at the center of Anatolia, Turkey, and you've given us and our students a great opportunity to get insights from you. So we are grateful. Thank you very much again.
It's been a great honor to talk to you. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you very much.